All right, so now we want to shift gears and think about these in terms of species. Okay, so I've presented these as two distinct species. And so what is a species? Let's try to define a species, okay? And so the things that we want when we think about a species is how species come to be and then how we define them, okay? So at its simplest idea, a species is the evolutionarily unique group of organisms belonging to multiple populations that can interbreed with each other and so on. But there are different ways to define species, and we'll talk about those as we move a little bit further forward. So we want to start off with thinking about how we get new species. So if you have species 1 and it has two populations, population 1 and population 2, typically there would be things happening in those populations such as mutations, selection, genetic drift, and then gene flow between the populations. So gene flow keeps the population similar because they're interbreeding with each other and sharing alleles back and forth. So even though there may be a mutation that arises, that mutation might get shared between the two populations. Now, if something happens that prevents gene flow, such as isolation, so the two populations no longer have gene flow between them, in that situation, you start to get differences accumulating in the two populations, and they do what's called diverge over time. They're evolving in isolation, and over time, you end up with species 1 and species 2, and that can take a very long time to happen. Once the two species are different enough, they get their own name, they are considered new species, different than the parent species, and that's the process of speciation. So we could see that sometime in the past that happened between golden-winged warblers and blue-winged warblers that led to them evolving into new species. All right, so we've got two main questions. What led to that isolation? How were they separated? Okay. And second, how different are they? Let's apply the different species concepts that we have to figure out how different they are. Now, if we look at this idea of isolation, it actually takes an incredibly long time. And these two species, blue-winged and golden-winged warblers, are considered pretty similar, but they diverged about 1.1 million years ago. So they last shared a common ancestor 1.1 million years ago. And since then, their lines have been diverging. So, these two species share 99.7% of their genomes, all right? So they still have a great deal of similarities, but there is some genetic divergence between them that allows us to think about why they would be two separate species. All right? As we look at the genetic differences, people did genetic sequencing of blue-winged and golden-winged warblers. And what they found was they are incredibly similar. In 6 locations only did they find a lot of variation. And 4 of those 6 locations are genes that code for feather development. So that would explain why they have different color patterns, but they share a lot of other characteristics. So speciation can be a lot more complex. Later in the semester, we'll spend a lot of time looking at speciation, but I wanted to give you this brief overview of it so we could apply it to the blue-winged and golden-winged warbler and think about it in that context. Okay, so as we try to define species, we apply 3 different species concepts to try to figure out whether things are different species. The first is called the biological species concept, then the morphological species concept, and finally the phylogenetic species concept. These 3 species concepts can be applied in different ways to help us determine, do things rise to the level of being distinct species. So the biological species concept considers populations to be evolutionarily independent, therefore separate species, if they are reproductively isolated from each other. So they cannot interbreed, or if they interbreed, they fail to produce viable fertile offspring. And a good example of that is a horse and a donkey. Okay? These two species would be considered as evolutionarily distinct lines. They can interbreed, but when they interbreed, the mule, the offspring of the two, is not viable, not able to reproduce. So it's a dead end. It can't reproduce. So that would support the idea of those being two separate species. So some of the shortcomings of these species concepts, though, are you can't apply this to populations that don't naturally overlap. Okay, so here we have the black-headed grosbeak and the rose-breasted grosbeak, and you can see that the black-headed grosbeak is found in the western United States, and the rose-breasted grosbeak mostly in the eastern United States, and then up into some of the Canadian provinces. And you can see that they come close to each other, but they don't overlap, so we can't really test whether they are the same species. And this is an important problem with the biological species concept. If two things don't overlap, we can't apply the biological species concept to determine whether they have the ability to interbreed. Right? The other problem is that many organisms are asexual, and so we can't apply it to asexual organisms either, because they don't interbreed, they just breed with themselves. So we can't test the biological species concept on these two species, so what can we use? So this is where the morphological species concept comes in, and we would look at these two and say that their morphology, their physical characteristics are different. All right? So we look at different morphological features. Here we would have, say, a red breast versus an orange breast, and white belly versus orange or yellow belly. And we would see those differences as allowing us to identify those as two separate species, much like we see different morphology in the blue-winged and golden-winged warbler. Now, it can be widely applied, but it has some pretty big disadvantages. Okay? If you've got two species that look the same, you can't really identify them. And it's very subjective what we use to identify separate species. So for example, we have the mallard, which is the most common duck species in North America and one you're pretty familiar with, and the black duck, and those two are considered separate species, even though they can interbreed, and they are related to other species that are considered separate species or subspecies depending on the relationship. And we see two very similar looking ones here, the mottled duck and the Mexican duck, and those two are considered separate from each other, and the Mexican duck is actually considered a subspecies of the mallard. The mottled duck is being considered a separate species. So it's a little bit arbitrary what makes one of those a separate species and what makes one of those a subspecies when they all look very different based on the morphological species concept. Similarly, we have these two birds, the green-winged teal, but the North American form and the Eurasian form, and they differ by the placement of the white bar on their side. They don't overlap, so we can't apply the biological species concept to see if they interbreed. And scientists have decided that that difference in the position of the white bar isn't enough to consider them as separate species, and they still consider them as one species, even though they do have differences. So then the third species concept is called the phylogenetic species concept. The phylogenetic species concept is based on reconstructing the evolutionary history of an organism. That's what we call a phylogeny. And so you use a phylogenetic tree that represents the ancestral history of or the evolutionary history of an organism, and you look for the smallest groups you can find, and those groups make up species. So as we find those small groups in a tree of life, those are the species. So the ends of branches become the species. Now, when I was younger, we thought there were only 2 species of elephants. That would be the African elephant and the Asian elephant. But as scientists did more work and developed better DNA techniques, they discovered that these 2, the African savanna elephant and the African forest elephant, were actually distinct evolutionary lines. Therefore, they could be considered separate species under the phylogenetic species concept, and then given different scientific names. And so this is the way that the phylogenetic species concept can be applied. And there are some disadvantages to this one as well. First off, we don't have phylogenies for a lot of organisms. We don't know the evolutionary history of a lot of different organisms. We also worry that once we start doing this, the size of the end of the branch that you're talking about could be incredibly small, and we could create lots of species that might not necessarily be considered species under other species concepts. So those are some of the things to think about with the phylogenetic species concept. Now, in actual practice, we use all 3 of these. And in your in-class assignment, you're going to look at all 3 of these and how they might apply to the blue-winged and golden-winged warblers. So the in-class assignment will let you explore further whether these are separate species. And it gets a little bit complicated. Now, we do have this idea that there is range overlap in these species. And they're occupying the same habitat and feeding on the same thing. So then the question arises, do they interbreed? So what we find is that they do indeed interbreed. And when they interbreed, the offspring of that reproduction are able to reproduce themselves. And here's what a first-generation hybrid looks like. So this is when a blue-winged warbler and a golden-winged warbler interbreed, and they produce something that was called a Brewster's warbler, but is not a true species. So it has the black eyeline of a blue-winged warbler, the golden wing bars of a golden-winged warbler, the white belly of a golden-winged warbler, the yellow chest of a blue-winged warbler, and you can see that it has all these different characteristics that from each of the parents. Now, if we allow 2 of these Brewster's warblers to interbreed, we go from Brewster's warblers, what are called an F1 hybrid, to the second generation of hybrids called F2 hybrids, and we get this bird called a Lawrence's warbler. And now you can see it's got different characteristics than the Brewster's warbler had. It has the black chin and mask that the golden-winged warbler had. It has the white wing bars of the blue-winged warbler, has the yellow belly of the blue-winged warbler. And so this hybrid is evidence that there is successful reproduction in the Brewster's hybrids, so that you can have continued reproduction of these different hybrids going forward. So what we're going to do in lecture is examine this a little bit further. We're going to talk about what allows them to coexist, what the genetic differences are, and whether they should be given species status. So that will be your in-lecture assignment for this week. There will be a short quiz when you finish this video, and then we will see you in class this week.